Hello, good evening again. So, for those of you who have been following along on the Facebook Live, I just want to let you know that I've now created a YouTube channel. And for those of you who are following me on the YouTube channel, I just want you to know that the original presentations are in Facebook Live. So, check there first. Welcome, and I see we've already got one person together with us tonight. So, tonight's topic is on ADHD, or Attention Deficit and Hyperactivity Disorder. Now, this is something that is very common in adults and children, and basically it's observed usually in kids by around age 3 or 4, and it becomes really noticeable in children in about 7 to 8 years of age. Basically, the symptoms seem to worsen in intensity during those early formative years. And then as the kids grow into adolescence, some of the hyperactive, impulsive behaviors tend to go down, and the impulsivity part of it seems to be persistent for a good part of life. And some of that is actually interesting in that it can lead to problems with certain adult behaviors, which I'll get into in a second. So what are the cardinal symptoms of ADHD, and what's this all about? Well, there's a lot of studies that show that it may be very strongly linked to genetics, and there's a few other environmental factors that seem to be playing a role as well. And a lot of those are just only recently beginning to be explored. The main features are difficulty with paying attention, and then also hyperactivity, impulsive behavior, and restlessness. So about 40 to 60% of the time, depending on which resource you're looking at, these symptoms that are diagnosed in childhood will sometimes persist through the teenage years and onwards through adulthood. However, there are also a significant number of children and adolescents that end up growing out of a lot of those behaviors. Although, as mentioned before, sometimes the impulsive tendencies, those habits tend to persist a little bit more. So how many adults tend to have ADHD? Well, they say in the United States that there's about 4% of adults in the United States, or 4.4 depending on the resource, have ADHD right now. And that's a fair amount of the adult population. And about internationally, 3.4%. So, and how does that manifest in adults? Well, much in the same way that you see it in the children. Sometimes decrease in working memory, having trouble shifting tasks from one task to the other, and self-monitoring, or being able to see how you're doing with the project, sometimes difficulty with initiating projects, and self-inhibition sometimes can be decreased as well. And adult ADHD, like the child ADHD, there's a little bit more trouble remaining focused in long and difficult tasks, or maintaining that attention in one space for a while. Organizing priorities, organizing activities and tasks, following through and completing tasks. That's something that is mentioned in both adults and children. In adults, it might be finishing that project for the boss. In children, they may have trouble finishing their homework, or something else is more infinitely interesting than what they're supposed to be doing at the moment. Forgetfulness, that's another one, where it seems like the memory just doesn't seem to latch on, and that has to do potentially with attention as well, because if you don't fully pay attention to something, not very likely that you're going to have any real good memory of it. And time management. So again, for the children, turning in tasks on time, completing their homework in a timely fashion, taking out the trash, those kinds of things that are essential to performing in a society of other human beings. It tends to be things that are a little bit harder for the folks that are suffering this to finish through on. And so sometimes for adults with ADHD, they have a tendency to run a little bit late or miss their appointment or, again, miss deadlines for projects. And in adulthood, the impulsivity actually has greater consequences than it does in childhood. It might be that as a child, the consequences are you don't do your homework, and if you don't have a special education plan or something to give you a little extra time or a little extra help or something to help mitigate that, not that big a deal. Maybe a slightly lower grade, or maybe they give you some makeup assignments or something to do later. But as an adult, sometimes when that impulsivity and those other tendencies are in there, there may be much bigger consequences. For example, walking into the boss and say, I quit, without having a good follow-on for your next job or something. And apparently adults with ADHD have a lot higher risk of accidents, and actually that's one of the leading causes of death of the adults with ADHD is, getting into accidents like car accidents and things along those lines. So the diagnosis of ADHD is one of those things that I tend to not do that diagnosis by myself. It very much is something that is a psychologist or a psychiatrist's office for making the diagnosis. There are some very standardized tests that are out there that are given to the parents and to the teachers and to the kids and so forth. And basically, it's not just enough that somebody shows a little bit of lack of attention or a little bit of fidgetiness or something in one social setting, but it really should be pervasive amongst multiple settings. And so when talking to somebody who has the diagnosis, it's very important to look at, okay, what are your goals at home? What are your goals at school or job for the adults? And then also social settings, do the people have goals in all three of those settings? Because all three of those settings are very important for functioning as a human and a well-adjusted person in these things. And so folks with ADHD often have greater barriers to kind of overcome because oftentimes, for one reason or another, the social skills tend to be significantly impaired as opposed to their peers in these groups. So this diagnoses are often associated with, hi Joe, and hi Liz earlier, are also associated with poor self-esteem, maybe because they have a harder time grasping the math or following along, whereas everybody else seems to be doing okay. Basically, the poor self-esteem tends to come up early on. And also, the folks with ADHD are also at much higher risk of having depression and anxiety. And part of me is thinking maybe there is some correlation, and so please stay tuned for our anxiety talks next week as well. There's also increased risk of other things like oppositional defiant disorder. So that kind of goes along with that impulsivity. Somebody wants to do something, you do not want to do something, and so kind of easy clashes along that. Now, another thing to be mindful of is sometimes there's a learning disability. So maybe when someone is struggling with paying attention, they might be just having extra difficulty processing it, and when it's hard to process it, well, you're not going to want to be as easily to pay attention to it because, man, it's hard work to understand what they're talking about on there. And so that's a couple of other things to keep in mind. And it's not to say, of course, that all children with ADHD or all adults with ADHD have had any of these conditions over time, just more likely in looking at the whole picture that these things may be a part of it. And to be mindful of that maybe there are other things contributing to this trouble with the concentration. And lastly, for the teenagers with this, there's a much greater risk of substance abuse. So somebody who's not paying attention in school or getting satisfaction from other things, they may have a tendency to self-stimulate in other ways. For example, turning to alcohol or other drugs in order to basically get the brain to get a light up that will cause that pleasure response. So, who is likely to get ADHD? Well, it does seem that this is something that is 2 to 3 times more common in boys in general rather than the girls. And there seems to be a very strong genetic risk factor for that. Now, mind you that there's also oftentimes lifestyle things that go together in certain families, so there may be a kind of a combination of that. But there's a lot of research being done in trying to find the genes for various conditions, and there seems to be a strong genetic component to the risk for ADHD. Also, there's a few other environmental risk factors. For example, in people that have had head injuries, for example, there's a lot of issues with attention. And so for children that have had a head injury of some sort in early childhood, they can definitely be at high risk for ADHD. And then early lead exposure. So there's a huge public health movement quite a few decades ago now, thankfully, where they were looking at the amount of lead that was present in things like toys and in paints and car gas and so forth. And they realized that all this lead was damaging the population. Concerted effort, they got together and pulled the lead out of a lot of these things. In some parts of the country, there may be still lead in the pipes and such, and so, of course, if you have any concerns, go get some water testing and make sure that your local water is A-OK for that. And this reminds me of some of the other things that are environmentally in our exposure that are kind of new in the last 100 years especially, and that includes a lot of the pesticides and some of the artificial colors and flavorings. So these things seem to be impactful on a number of levels, and no, I'm not suggesting that everybody live in a bubble and never get out and experience the world. But there seems to be some correlation with people who are exposed to high levels of pesticides, for example. There was a study out on a farm in California where the pregnant women who were working near or that were living near these fields where there was these agricultural sprays of basically pesticides and other chemicals, the ones that had the highest levels of the chemicals in their bloodstream, it turned out that their children, when they followed up with them later on, lost an average of 7 IQ points. And they also had much greater risk for attention, development issues, and short-term memory issues, as opposed to places where those pesticides were not nearly as common. And so that's just one example that we know about. And so I think over the years we'll probably see more studies along these lines. People are pointing at very popular pesticides and saying that it can bind up some of the minerals, and it seems that the children that have ADHD symptoms do have a tendency to have lower mineral concentrations in their body. For example, they have low zinc levels compared to controls, and a little bit lower levels of iron, copper, zinc, and calcium, all of which are found in your nuts, your seeds, your beans, and your dark green leafy vegetables and other incredibly healthy foods. As far as supplementation with these types of things, I really believe that getting these things in through the diet is going to be far superior than trying to take a powdered talcumed whatever's in their pill to get these in there. We really need to have more research on these areas. I do know anecdotally of some folks who have used different combinations of these things to improve the health of their children. However, I just don't know enough about it professionally to be able to recommend those sources as of yet. So stay tuned. There'll probably be more research and more presentations on this to come in the upcoming years. So, other things that can be influential on attention and attention deficit. Let's see. Dyes are another environmental thing that is fairly new in our society, and they are pervasive. Somebody gave us some chocolates a long time ago, and still have the box sitting around here, And even in this one, it says all sorts of corn syrups and things, and FD&C red number 40, and it's hard to read on there, but buried in this giant list of mostly unpronounceable ingredients to make this little chocolate thing. Even that is got dyes in it, because not that you're necessarily going to see the redness or not redness of the cherry if you just pop it in your mouth, but if you were to cut in half, boy, you'd be disappointed if you didn't have a bright red cherry in the middle of that, chocolate-covered cherry box, right? And so we love our food colorings. As a matter of fact, to the tune of 15 million pounds. That's pretty incredible. Huge, huge, huge amount. So 15 million pounds of food dyes are used per year in our between our cosmetics and our food products. So cosmetics, things that go on the lips or the cheeks and all to make us pretty, so to say. And so they're used for fun. And the other main uses of them in our food supply is to conceal the absence of fruits and veggies. In other words, if you are having a cherry popsicle, you'd be pretty disappointed to have a gray cherry popsicle as opposed to a bright red cherry popsicle. Or in this day and age, raspberry is what color? Fluorescent blue, right? I've never seen a blue raspberry, but it seems to be the one the industries have associated with us for our taste buds and our expectations. So we expect to see these things these days because it's so prevalent. And then lastly, they're used to make basically unattractive mixtures of random stuff that they mix in there to make them attractive or to make them more attractive to us. So what's the deal with all these food dyes? I have met somebody once a long time ago in clinic, a few years ago, and I was starting to tell them a little about the links between the research on some of the food dyes and the ADHD and the impulsiveness and the hyperactive behaviors in some of the children. And they just looked at me and said, "I don't believe in any of that stuff." And I was like, okay, obviously not reaching anybody there today at this moment, but it actually turns out that whether or not you believe in it, some of these food dyes actually have an impact on the functioning of the brain. Now, that's not just on the kids that have ADHD. Last summer, I attended a conference up in the Washington, D.C. area. The Physicians Committee for Responsive Medicine had this lovely conference, and one of the researchers there was actually one of the key people that had discovered that the food dyes actually were increasing the inattentiveness and the hyperactivity, not just in the ADHD brain, but in normal brains as well. And so his point was, it's not just a health hazard for the kids that have this condition, but as a population of people that are getting exposed to it, and especially the children tend to be more vulnerable in general to the effects of chemicals and dyes and things like that than the adults do. So what do we do with this information? So basically, in the United States, we have largely ignored, I gotta say, this information. There's been a few grassroots efforts by folks that have done petitions to places like the macaroni and cheese companies and so forth to try to get them to pull the dyes from some of the foods that are marketed and sold to children, as, of course, again, you can't just have regular mac and cheese, you have to have fluorescent yellow mac and cheese, right? Looks better than brown, I guess, I don't know. But basically, we haven't really done a lot in this country as of yet. So who knows, maybe more grassroots petitions and things will develop to put some more market pressure on the companies, because that's what they tend to respond to, is people changing their buying habits, and then they change their manufacturing habits. In the government of Britain, basically, once this landmark study came out a few years ago, and mind you, this was a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled food challenge that showed that these dyes and colors increase the inattentiveness, the impulsivity, and the hyperactivity in the young children. And so they're the pragmatic Brits. They said, hey, this stuff is not actually needed for us. Why don't we just pull it from the market? And they did. And in the European Union, the response was essentially, okay, if you guys are going to keep using these dyes, you have to put a warning label on it saying that essentially that it increases inattentiveness, impulsivity, and hyperactivity in the young children. And so in the European countries, by and large, even our manufacturing companies that are making some of these food products, they basically have a version that's there for Americans, and then they have a version that they export to the European countries that does not have many of these food dyes and things added to in the first place. And because as part of my job, I get to talk to a broad variety of people. And one day I happened to have in my office somebody that worked for one of these food industry companies. And it's always a little fun when I get a chance to talk to them because of my background in food and everything. And I asked him point blank, I said, okay, why is it that in Europe they've gone to such measures to take all these things out? In America, we haven't. What's the deal? Why don't they just switch out yellow number something or other with turmeric or something else that is equally as bright fluorescent yellow? And by the way, turmeric does stain if you get on anything, so just be careful with that stuff because it is a food dye for sure. And he pointed out that it basically all boiled down to, you guessed it, profit and productivity. Because apparently the shelf life of the artificial dyes, which are made of petroleum products or something, you might want to check it out later and see what the stuff actually comes from. The chemical names are usually pretty darn long on these things. And basically, when you use a artificial non-food chemical, it has a much longer shelf life than, say, the plant-based turmeric or something that's a more natural kind of dye. And so they pointed out that if you're a gas station who's selling a little row of mac and cheese boxes, you're going to want to have the boxes that last on the shelf for about 4 or 5 years or 3 years or whatever it happens to be, because you're not going to sell a box of mac and cheese every day. Maybe sell it every 3 months, and the more time that it spends on the shelf, or the longer it's able to spend on the shelf, the more likely you are to make a profit from that purchase. And so, again, just for primarily financial reasons, it seems that the companies are mostly using these artificial dyes in there. So just a little glance at some of the psychosocial factors that are going on in our country and society right now, and part of the reasons why some of these things are kind of known but not as much acted on out there. So as far as how can you use this practically in treating a child or adult too with ADHD. So I have had some success with some of my children that I've counseled in clinic where the parents actually went ahead and were very, very mindful to avoid the artificial colorings and ingredients and so forth in favor of more whole food product kind of things that basically the ingredient on the label is, like, for example, apples. There's not a lot of ingredients in there other than apples, you know. And what I've noticed is that some of the children were able to, again, anecdotally, either not need the medication as much or just need lower doses of medication, and so forth. So this is one example of how some of this information can be used practically. So again, there's no real need for any of these food colorings or additives in our diet. It's all put in there through the powers of chemistry for better living, I guess, as they say. Other things that can be done for ADHD as well are behavioral. So that's something that I really wish to see a lot more of in our kids with ADHD. In other words, things that can be done are having them sit closer to the teacher, a daily report card, for example, where they have tasks and other things written down on them, and then they go to their teacher and or the parents, and they reinforce, like, hey, little Johnny did this and this and this. Extended time to finish your tasks, and then replacing screen time with exercise. Now, that is a big one. So when Dr. Barnard originally put that note in the Nutrition MD resource, back then the main thing was TV screens. And nowadays the telephones and the iPads and the other screens are ubiquitous in our environment. And I really think that we will probably see more of the effects of this in the upcoming years. Right now, it's kind of a big social experiment. American Academy of Pediatricians recommends less than 2 hours of screen time for our children, and below, I think it's age 5 or age 6, don't quote me exactly on that, basically no screen time for the kids. And there seems to be some delay in some of the other cognitive skills, such as the kids running around and being able to play softball or kick a ball or do other things, because again, the kids are not getting out and running around as much as they used to. So by replacing screen time with exercise, you're actually tackling quite a few of the things that are problematic in the ADHD children. For example, it has been shown to decrease the disruptive behaviors, maybe because they're able to get out and run out and run off the adrenaline surge and so forth. The sports and the social activities also help the kids to learn better social skills. And there's another fun thing that happens with the exercise. One of the ways in which the stimulant medications and so forth work is they basically boost the dopamine and norepinephrine. Basically, they boost some of the brain chemicals. And some of the extended release versions that last for up to 12 hours. Now, it might take a while to kick in, like 30, 40 minutes or an hour to fully kick in. But in some of these extended release formulations, the chemicals are up there for quite a long time. And exercise, though, it works immediately, and it has other far-reaching advantages. So in other words, it's a very healthy habit for the kids to have, improves blood flow to the brain, and allows them to socialize and to maybe get over some of the social anxiety and the other things that that oftentimes go along with the ADHD in there. So that wraps it up as far as some of the nutritional influences, as well as some of the genetic and the other influences on creating the scenario of why we seem to have a fair amount of ADHD in this country. As far as some of the other treatments, again, medicament treatments always discuss with your primary care physician. Highly, highly recommend that before a child starts any medical treatments, that they actually have a confirmed diagnosis, not just a, I want my kid to do better on the test kind of thing, which it seems like sometimes there's a new push to try to have more and more of our children on these medications because sometimes parents see it as like an advantage, like if only I could get Susie to focus on their homework for an extra hour every night, then maybe they'll get into that top-rate college or something. And so even a normal child that's put on amphetamines, you know, it's going to have an impact on many things. And so there seems to be a kind of a push lately in society to try to do that. So I encourage people to kind of back away from that and try to first confirm the diagnosis before using the medications. After all, the main stimulant medications, which actually are indeed effective 60-70% of the time as well, which is why they are so popular, like Ritalin and Adderall. The newest trend is Vyvanse is out there. But literally 20 million scripts a year are being written for our children. And this is one of the fastest growing medication trends that's out there currently, to the tune of, about 0.8 million more prescriptions per year. So probably in the next couple of years we'll be seeing 23, 25 million a year on these. And again, these medications are not necessarily benign. In kids and adults both, it can cause trouble with the appetite, insomnia, anxiety and irritability tend to be increased when you're taking these stimulants, and then headaches can happen. And for the adults who end up on one or more of these medications, there's stimulants that I just mentioned, and there's some non-stimulant medications. For the adults, the non-stimulant medications have a tendency to be a little bit safer. I believe Strattera is one of the main ones that's out there currently. although sometimes even that one is associated sometimes with liver problems, so make sure that if somebody that's on them or yourself are taking them, to get your blood work monitored periodically to make sure everything's doing okay. And so in adults who are taking the stimulants, as we get older, our hearts become a lot more sensitive to the effects of the stimulants and other things that are out there. So there's a little bit higher risk for heart rhythm disorders and so forth. So for me, I tend to like to get a baseline EKG before starting these medications, and I have had one person that indeed shortly after starting one of these things ended up having to go to the ER with a heart issue shortly thereafter. And in that case, you're able to show, yep, we had a baseline EKG that was okay. The medication EKG, a little bit different after that, and so for them, no medications were needed. But that's one of the risk factors of these medications. And sometimes these medications also can raise the blood pressure and the pulse of people who are taking them as well. So those are a few other things to consider when basically looking at the medications. In children, there's also sometimes a tendency for the growth curve to be a little bit stunted, and then once medications are stopped, they kind of catch up with it. So that's kind of a common trend that we see as well. And last but not least, so I know I talked a lot about different environmental factors, some food factors, and other things. There's a few more things that I would like to mention with regards to the ADHD, and that's a few simple things that can also be done to enhance life for the children with it. So there's been some studies that drinking a tall glass of water first thing in the morning actually improves school functioning and cognitive function in the children, and so that's good for the adults too, starting the day off with a full 8-ounce glass of water. I don't recommend having it with flowers, but here just for decoration. But anyway, and then getting plenty of sleep, always good for improving the functioning of the brain, and always having good wholesome foods, in other words, especially in the realm of having lots of plant foods. So there are plenty of pigments that are available, but if they're a natural pigment, such as in these wild black rice here, those kinds of food colorings are going to have immensely beneficial health benefits to the body. In other words, the more colorful the food is naturally, the more antioxidants and more health benefits it'll tend to have for you as well. Alrighty, well, thank you for joining, and I look forward to talking to you again next time. Next week, we'll be talking a little bit about anxiety, and I might have some other little additional videos with a few extra attention and memory exercises and stuff that can be done by anyone to as a supplement to play with and practice training and focusing the attention. So thank you all for watching. Oh, hi Doc, or hi Donna, and thank you, Sherry. Alrighty, well, I'm going to close out for right now, but this will be available to everybody very soon if you want to check out the beginning of the video, and again, after a little bit, I'll upload it up to the new YouTube channel as well. Alright, take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.